Okay? All right, so what we got, I'm going to need to take this time today because I just want to get certain key ideas across, which we're going to actually need later on. But the first thing I want to say is if we had a little more time, what I'd like you to think about is suppose you're, an advanced country on the one hand, and then let's suppose you're a developing country. So where do you want to be in terms of attracting activities in the value chain? Okay, so presumably if you're going to be an advanced country, you want to get this kind of stuff, because these are high productivity activities. They require a lot of skill. They support, R&D and all that good stuff. If you're a developing country, you'd love to be able to have this stuff, but nobody's going to give it to you anytime soon. Brazil's done pretty well. Developing countries, particularly less developed countries, are going to have to start over here and say, well, hopefully we can get one of those 180 sales and service locations. And then if we're good boys and girls and create a decent business environment, and we actually use trucks in our country, we might be able to bag, one of these assembly plants. Now, we can bag an assembly plant if we're Saudi Arabia by just saying, okay, guys, put one here or we're going to not let you sell here. And the question you should all ponder, is that a good idea? If you're a country, do you really want to attract investment by saying you can't do business here unless you put a facility here? Is that the way to move up? Or not? And that's a question we're going to be looking at, because a lot of countries do that. They say, look, here's the tax. You have to have a joint venture partner. You have to put a facility here to sell here. And the question is that a good idea? That might get you Morocco's 20 units a year. The question is that going to create an environment and an appreciation on the part of the foreign investor to want to actually build their presence in that particular country. So let's ponder that. I guess the implication is, if somebody forced me to operate in their country to do business there, I'm not sure I'd feel warm and fuzzy about, expanding if there was no other economic motivation to be there. The question then that foreign investment attractors are always asking is, what can I get? What's the best I can get? And then how do I create the conditions to move up the ladder of productivity? That's the essential challenge of economic development, is how to move up the ladder of productivity to more sophisticated activities, to more advanced skill requirements, to more R&D content, so that we can actually support really, really high wages. That's the challenge. So when you're a country and you're trying to attract foreign investment and upgrade your economy, one has to have kind of an exquisite understanding of all this stuff to know what to go for. I mean, you can make 500 sales calls on companies to get an engine plant, but you'll never get a single one. If you don't have the right conditions. On the other hand, you're going to probably be able to talk them into a sales and service facility, and if you're really clever and you have a strategy where you're open to trade with all your neighboring countries, you might even be able to bag one of those assembly plants. And if you have some skills in the automotive sector and some suppliers, maybe you can bag a little bit more. So that's the thinking process. But it all starts with understanding how these multinationals compete, because they are often, multinational investment into a country is what we call an accelerator. It allows you to really ramp your development process more rapidly. If you have to kind of build the skills one step at a time and so forth, it goes very, very slowly, but this is kind of an accelerator. If you can get a major investment in your country by a sophisticated company, that creates all kinds of positive ripple effects. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the course. Okay. Why isn't this? There we go. Okay. Now, in thinking about the company side of competitiveness, I just want to get across a few kind of fundamental principles here, and I'm going to go quickly, but we will talk about some of these later. What we know about company competitiveness is that if you want to be competitive, you have to have the right goal. And the right goal is return on invested capital. Return on invested capital has to be the principal goal of any company. If you don't earn a good return on invested capital, there's no honor in being big, there's no honor in growing. Because ultimately, return on capital is the only measure of true economic value. So, so as a slide says, growth is good, but only if you can achieve an attractive return on capital. Because if you're not achieving an attractive return on capital, you're not utilizing the resources effectively and productively in the company. And as I say on the bottom, corporate governance structures that hold companies accountable for profitability enhance competitiveness. And we see this over and over again. There are lots of countries where you see companies with lots of different objectives. They want to be big. They want to have a large corporate group. Profitability. There's very little corporate governance pressure on the companies. Those countries always have trouble improving their competitiveness, because if companies don't have to earn a profit and they're not pushed to earn a profit, then it's very hard for the true competitiveness of the country to move ahead. This actually was a big hurdle in Japan. In Japan, companies didn't put profitability as their principal objective for many years, and Japan had a 12-year disaster because the companies were they were in too many products. They were not ultimately competitive, and that had to work itself out over a long period of time. So one of the things we're always looking at when we look at a country is what are the corporate goals, what are the governance structures, and how do those affect really the fundamental motivations of the company. We know that, of course, to achieve attractive profitability, you have to be able to either command an attractive price, ideally a higher price, or you have to be lower cost. And this is kind of strategy principle 101. But what we find is that the kind of process of development requires that the company in the country shift its advantage from lower input costs, where they tend to start, to ultimately higher productivity. And this is the transformation that has to occur in economic development. Most often you see countries start out where the companies are mostly competing on cheap inputs, low-cost labor, cheap resources, lots of abundant land, so you can plant stuff, and it's really low cost to plant the stuff. The kind of next stage in economic development usually is where you become much more efficient because you have modern machinery and capital. So you don't have unique products, you can't command very high prices, but you can be much more efficient and you start moving up the productivity ladder. And then the very advanced countries tend to be often countries that can actually achieve higher value products, unique products, very high prices. And that supports even higher levels of productivity, along with good manufacturing. So again, in thinking about the company perspective of how do you achieve superior profitability, you can kind of see how that will reflect itself in how the country's economy will develop. All competitive advantage emanates from the value chain, from the activities involved in conducting the business, and we've talked about that, and you've read about that. And so in order to analyze the company competitiveness, we need to kind of think about the value chain and how well the companies in the country are competing in terms of the activities in the value chain. And that leads to the very fundamental distinction between really operational excellence and strategic positioning. Operational excellence has to do with achieving best practice. When you're a developing country, you're way behind best practice. Your plants aren't efficient. You don't have the latest machinery. You don't have good IT systems. You don't have good logistics. The first challenge of development is becoming operationally effective. It's assimilating all the stuff that's already been learned in the rest of the world. And that's what developing countries are struggling to do, and get their companies up to best practice. It's assimilating new technology. It's really not creating new technology. Ultimately, to have an advanced economy, you've got to ultimately have companies that can actually develop strategic uniqueness, that can produce superior products, better products, with new features or better brands or better services. And in a sense, the transformation from developing country to advanced country, there's kind of a metaphor about that, the transformation of the two sides of this particular chart. And again, we're going to be looking at a lot of countries, and we're going to be looking at their firms and how they're competing. And so, be thinking about this distinction as we look at those countries. Let's move on. Strategic positioning comes from having a unique value proposition. So the company is actually delivering unique value to the customers it chooses to serve. In order to deliver a unique value proposition, the company has to develop its own unique way of competing in the business, distinctive activities. This is just an example of BMW. Again, we see BMWs in highly advanced economies. The challenge for developing economies is to develop companies that actually compete this way, rather than just imitate the foreign companies, rather than just try to do the same thing but do it cheaper because you have lower wages. That, in a sense, is a metaphor for the challenges of economic development. Now, we see strategic positioning not just in the advanced countries. The most successful companies in developing countries, emerging economies, are those companies that go beyond just the cheap labor and imitating the foreigners and develop really unique strategies. This is an example from Brazil. An airline that's just done terrific. It's really succeeding against all the foreigners because it's got a distinctive position. Here's another company that's in the fast food business that's driven KFC out of Central America because it didn't try to do the same thing. It actually had its own distinctive strategy tailored to the needs of the markets that they serve. So strategy thinking can get embedded in developing countries. And again, to the extent that you have more and more companies thinking this way and competing this way, rather than just mindlessly imitating the foreigners, you have a country that's going to improve. And this slide just talks about some of the common strategy errors or company errors you see in emerging economies. And basically what has to happen is that in an emerging economy you have to get over these things. Companies have to move to the next level of sophistication in order for the country to move to higher levels of productivity. So, in emerging economies, you tend to have low investment, reliance on foreign partners for everything, lack of up-to-date product performance, compete almost solely on price, imitate what the Westerners do or the foreigners do. Those things will hold back the country and keep it at a relatively low level of development. The challenge of development is for the corporate sector to transform itself into that kind of competition that we talked about in the past. The same thing applies to corporate groups. What we know is that when you diversify, the only way to add value and truly improve productivity is where you diversify into businesses where there's interrelationships or synergies across the related businesses. But what happens in developing economies is that instead of having the synergies like you would see in a Walt Disney, you end up with these very large corporate groups. So the typical pattern, as we saw in the old Finland, was large conglomerates in many, many different businesses. And you see on the right how many different kind of businesses. This is very typical in almost every developing country. Why does this happen? It happens because in a very inefficient economy with poor capital markets, where there's a lot of government intervention, where there's a lot of distortions in the market, companies, if they have capital and if they have power, political power and market power, they're able to make very favorable deals and get into a lot of different businesses. And so if you know the minister, you get the concession. If you're the big company in an unstable country, the foreign partner wants to work with you. So all of a sudden you end up with this big corporate group. But the problem with these developing country conglomerates is that they really don't improve productivity. They just have power. And that power is usually exercised to retard the kind of changes that are necessary for the country to become more productive. So because many of these business units in the groups are almost monopolies, they have a dominant position in their market, they don't want more competition, they don't want openness to trade, they don't want open regulation, they just want to preserve the status quo. So these corporate groups are really usually a danger sign in a developing country or an emerging country. As long as you have those, you've got a big anchor that's holding back improvements in competitiveness. And what we see as countries evolve, and this is just some continuation of that earlier slide, as countries evolve, what you want is your business groups to break up and become more focused. You want them to not be totally local, which most business groups are local. They produce primarily for the local market. They may export commodities. You want the business groups to start focusing on a few businesses and start competing regionally and globally. And when that starts to happen, that's a very good sign that you've reached a higher level of competitiveness. That's a very positive development. And what we found from the Global Competitiveness Report and other data sets, that any country that has a lot of its economy in large corporate groups is going to have a lower GDP per capita. That's a very strong finding, because it's a sign, a signal that the vitality of competition and the effectiveness of the rules and regulations in the economy are not what they should be. So now we talk about the question of competing across borders. What I've talked about so far are just some of the basic principles of competition. Now, how do we think about competing across borders? Well, there's some key questions here for economic development. Why do MNCs choose particular locations? How does each country fit into the overall strategy? What steps can the multinational take to enhance the value of the location? What would it cause them to want to do more in that location? And then, of course, the implications for the host country. The kind of basic tool for understanding how to think about the globalization or internationalization of the multinational, of course, is the value chain. Some of the activities in the value chain, as you read, are often tied to the customer location, like the sales and service locations. That's why there's 180 of them. But many of the activities in the value chain, particularly today in the year 2008, can be done in almost any location, including operating your IT center and having your call center and producing your engines. And so the fundamental question is, how do we think about how the multinational makes these location decisions and these decisions to disperse activities to other parts of the world? And we talked about a great example of that, and I think our discussion was right on target. And of course, it's a different discussion in every single industry. If we were talking about Boeing aircraft, we'd have a very different discussion. The transportation costs for Boeing aircraft are zero. You just fire it up, and fly it. The transportation cost for Intel semiconductors, as we'll see a little later on, because we're going to talk about Intel, is basically zero. You can put all the world's chips for a year in one plane and just fly it. All semiconductors are shipped by air because it's such a dense, high-value product. The shipping cost is very small. So we talked today about a particular product. Trucks happen to be very bulky, very heavy, and therefore the transport cost is high, and that's why they're dispersed assembly plants. Yeah, Boeing is going to make pretty much every one of their 747s in one plant, and then they're just going to fire them up and send them out there. But they're going to need sales and service, in each country. The only reason Boeing ever buys parts from outside of the United States is because they have to do that in order to get the government airlines to buy the planes. It's not efficient. They would love to have all their parts manufacturers literally in a circle around their assembly plant. But they have to. But you often have to make trade-offs in the economic set of locations because of distortions of various kinds, and the same is true, by the way, of Airbus. Except they also have the additional problem of being owned in a multinational structure. So again, their value chain is not optimized from an economic point of view either. Luckily they're both pretty good companies, and so we're not panicked about flying on their planes. But in any event, every industry is different, and I want to emphasize that. So when you're thinking about attracting foreign investment, every industry is different. And also what this suggests is that a particular country is going to be a much better location for some businesses than others. And having a really good understanding of what kind of businesses fit the country's strengths and capabilities is really a critical part of economic development and particularly of FDI policy. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. The reading covered kind of these globalizing and localizing forces. There's a different mix in every industry, and we saw a pretty interesting mix here in this case. And all this then leads to some very interesting questions that the host country has to address. And of course, the host country is going to have very different circumstances depending on how advanced the economy is, what mix of clusters are already there, what companies already are there, and you can read through some of the questions. And so as we think about economic strategy and as we think about the various countries we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester, always in the back of our minds, we've got to keep this company stuff in mind. Because if we start having grand public policy ideas without being able to ground it, in the stuff we talked about today, we're going to be just as silly as Volvo was trying to enter the U.S. market. Because we're not going to understand what's really driving the kind of economic choices of the actors that we really care about, which are the firms. Okay, well, next week we're gonna move on in the course, and I just want to warn you that next Monday we're going to discuss an industry which many of you probably think produces fossils. We're going to discuss fax machines in Japan. And it turns out that Japan dominated the world fax machine industry. And I just want to let you know that although the fax machine seems like it's a dinosaur, there were more fax machines sold last year than ever before. Okay? So when you read this case, your natural instinct is going to be to put your head down on your desk and say, why am I reading this case? Okay? But I want you to know this is a classic. This is a classic case in how to think about the diamond model. Okay? So I want us to learn with a classic, and then we're going to get to some newer and sexier stuff as we go forward. Okay? So the $64,000 question for Monday is, why does Japan dominate the fax machine industry, even though, as we'll come to see, it didn't invent it. It was late to get in. And that question turns out to be a really great example of how to think about locations and why locations are competitive. Okay? So we'll see you next week.